When I was 7 years old, my family and I took a trip to Yellowstone National Park. We drove up the mountain as far as the road would possibly take us, and then we finally got to the parking lot where we were supposed to meet our guide, assistant, and a cook. The guide and his assistant pulled a bunch of horses out of a trailer and a bunch of pack mules, and we met up with 2 other families that were going to be traveling with us. They assigned us each horses. My horse's name was Babe. She was a dark bay, older quarter horse mare. My father was also assigned a dark bay quarter horse, but it was a gelding. My mom, on the other hand, was assigned a psychotic black and white paint, but I'll get to that bit later. One of the other young girls of another family got on her horse a chestnut thoroughbred gelding, and the young girl had never ridden a horse before in her life. The only thing she knew was that if she pulled back on the reins and said, "Whoa," her horse would stop. So she got on, and the first thing her horse started to do was back up. So instinctively, the little girl pulled back on the reins really hard and said, "Whoa." And since the horse was already moving backwards, the tight tension on the reins told him to move back farther backwards and faster, and it panicked the little girl, so she couldn't do anything else except pull back and yell, "Whoa." And as she was backing up, the cliff behind her got closer and closer and closer. Finally, the horse got so confused and frustrated that he reared up and flipped over backwards. The little girl fell off. Thankfully, it wasn't crushed, or neither one of them were hurt. We got everybody back on their horses safely, and we started off on the trail. About an hour in, the horses started to get a little antsy. They were teetering sideways, looking all around. Their ears were flipping in every direction, listening. And if some horse in front of them stepped on a twig and it made a snap, all of the horses would jump. Then finally we realized what it was. On a cliff, about 30 feet above our heads, was a giant male grizzly bear, just peering down on us. Thankfully, there was no way for the bear to get down off the cliff and get to us, so we just passed by and finally got out of its way. We finally reached our first destination for the night. We pitched our tents, turned the horses loose, and unpacked the mules, strung the food up into the trees, and got a campfire going. As the cook was preparing our dinner, we heard one of the mules bray, and as we looked out to the side, there was a line of 12 wolves passing in between the horses and our group. We just watched nervously as these 12 wolves trotted across the field, obviously going out on a hunt. The male in the front of the pack, the alpha, was a big black wolf. He probably weighed 130 pounds. But they just passed right by and didn't bother us or the horses and disappeared into the night. Later that night, my mother and I went to travel up this hill about 200 feet away to the designated latrine spot. And in order to get to that spot, we had to climb over several dead trees that had fallen in a fire the previous year. As I was climbing over some of the trees, I dropped my flashlight, and I bent down and put my hand on a limb and reached between 2 trees to pick up my flashlight, and then snap. The limb broke, and my face collided with the tree bark in front of me. I hit the bark with such force that both the outside and inside of my nose were bloody, and when I got back, my face was already bruising. After everybody had finally heard what had happened, nobody seemed satisfied with my story. They all wanted me to tell people that the wolves had chased me and I had tripped and fallen. But to a 7-year-old, that was a lie, and lies were bad. We woke up the next morning to cursing. It was the cook. She had gotten up just past dawn and was starting to prepare breakfast, but she had instead found one of our food barrels that had been up in the tree was on the ground and had been opened. A bear had gotten into our campsite the previous night and got the food barrel down, opened it, and scattered its contents everywhere. There was beef jerky packets that were empty. There were fruit cans that had been torn open and licked clean. Everything was gone, except for 4 cans. There was 1 can of peas that had been opened, but the peas were just scattered all over the ground. There were 3 other cans, also peas, and they didn't have a dent on them. Not opened, completely untouched. Apparently, the bear that had raided our campsite decided after he tried the peas that he didn't like them very much. And he decided not to open the other 3 cans. Apparently, they can read. We went to go saddle the horses and go on to our next part of the trip. And when we went to go catch them, they decided that they weren't having any of it. My mom's psychopathic horse took off down the side of the canyon with his hobbles on, and he galloped down the side of the valley and took all the other horses with him. It took the guide and his assistant over 2 hours to track them down with the mules and herd them back. So by the time we got back on the trail, it was almost lunchtime. After we had crossed over the top of the mountain and were coming down on the other side, our trail down this steep, winding trail. The left side was a cliff face of straight rock that went right up on the side, on the left. And on the right, 4 or 5 feet over, was a cliff that went straight down to the river below. My mom's horse decided that he wanted to try and kill her. So he put his head down between his knees and locked his knees around his ears and shimmied out of his bridle. And my mom was left on the edge of a cliff on a horse with no way to control it. She couldn't get off because there was a rock wall on the left, or she'd fall. So she had to lean out of the saddle over the edge of the cliff, take the bridle, and reposition it back on the horse's head so she could have control again. We finally made it back down the mountain, all in one piece, even though I had fallen asleep on the trail down. And that's the end of my story.